I pulled the fire alarm at exactly 2:47 p.m., watching through the security monitor as Dante Marchetti's billion-dollar deal exploded into chaos. And in that moment, with my heart hammering against my ribcage like a prisoner desperate for freedom, everyone in that gleaming conference room thought I was the crazy new assistant who'd just committed career suicide in the most spectacular way possible. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know as they scrambled toward the exits with briefcases clutched to their chests and expensive Italian loafers sliding across polished marble, was that in exactly 90 seconds, a sniper's bullet would have torn through Dante Marchetti's skull and painted the floor-to-ceiling windows with fragments of the most dangerous mind in organized crime. The alarms shrieked through the building like mechanical banshees, drowning out the furious shouts of men who'd been negotiating shipping routes worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. And I stood frozen in the security alcove on the 23rd floor, my fingers still trembling against the red lever, watching the monitors flicker between camera feeds that showed the carefully orchestrated chaos I'd unleashed, spreading through Marchetti Industries like wildfire through dry brush. 6 months of playing invisible. 6 months of being the mousy data analyst that nobody looked at twice. 6 months of collecting evidence for the FBI and pretending I didn't notice the blood money flowing through the legitimate tech company's accounts like poison in pristine water. All of it was about to come crashing down around me because I'd made a choice that my handler would call reckless and my conscience would call necessary. My name is Sarah Volkoff, and before today, the most dangerous thing I'd ever done was agree to become a federal informant embedded in a mafia organization's corporate front, accepting a job analyzing network security for a company that laundered hundreds of millions through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore shell corporations, learning to smile blandly at men who casually discussed debt collection methods that involved broken bones and shallow graves, perfecting the art of being so thoroughly unremarkable that I could move through their world like a ghost collecting evidence of their crimes. 26 years old with a computer science degree from MIT and a bone-deep need to believe I was one of the good guys, I'd walked into this assignment thinking I understood the stakes, thinking I could maintain the clinical detachment necessary to watch crimes unfold without intervening, thinking I could separate the data I collected from the human cost of the violence it represented. I'd been wrong about so many things, but I'd been especially wrong about my capacity to watch a man die when I had the power to prevent it. Even if that man was Dante Marchetti, even if his hands were stained with the kind of blood that doesn't wash away, even if saving him meant destroying everything I'd worked for and possibly signing my own death warrant in the process. The realization that something was catastrophically wrong had hit me approximately 4 minutes ago, when I'd been routing through archived security footage for my FBI handler and noticed an anomaly in the traffic patterns on the street-facing cameras from this morning. A white panel van that had circled the block 3 times before parking in a loading zone with a perfect sightline to the 24th floor conference room, remaining there for exactly 7 minutes, while a figure in maintenance coveralls disappeared into the service entrance of the building across the street. Protocol said I should have called my handler immediately, should have let the federal bureaucracy grind through its channels and make official decisions about threats and responses. But something in my gut had twisted with urgent certainty when I cross-referenced the van's arrival time with Dante's calendar and realized the Yakuza delegation meeting had been scheduled for weeks, announced in trade publications, practically advertised to anyone who wanted to know when the head of the Marchetti organization would be sitting in one specific room at one specific time. I'd pulled up the current exterior camera feeds with fingers that had already started shaking, scanning the rooftop of that building across the street. And there it was. The unmistakable glint of metal in the afternoon sun. The shadow of a human form pressed flat against the rooftop access housing. The telltale profile of a rifle barrel angled directly toward the conference room windows, where Dante Marchetti sat at the head of a table surrounded by his underbosses and the stone-faced representatives of the Yamaguchi Gumi, discussing territorial agreements and profit-sharing arrangements that would reshape the criminal landscape of the entire eastern seaboard. The choice had crystallized in my mind with terrible clarity, sharp-edged and unforgiving as broken glass, because I could either run to building security and try to convince them that the quiet data analyst had discovered an assassination plot in progress, which would take precious minutes I didn't have, while they verified my credentials and contacted Dante's personal protection detail and argued about jurisdiction and protocol. Or I could do something immediate and catastrophic that would empty that conference room in seconds, even if it meant exposing myself to scrutiny. I absolutely could not survive. So I'd run, taking the emergency stairwell up one floor, because the executive level required badge access that my credentials didn't include. My sensible flats slapping against concrete steps, while my mind raced through the implications of what I was about to do. And I'd bypassed the authentication on the fire alarm panel with a trick I'd learned in college that involved shorting 2 specific wires with a paperclip from my pocket. And I'd pulled the lever with both hands because my fingers were shaking too badly to trust just one. And now here I was, watching the evacuation unfold on the monitors, while my entire carefully constructed cover story crumbled around me like a sandcastle at high tide. The conference room had erupted into controlled chaos, men in expensive suits moving with the quick efficiency of people who'd survived in dangerous worlds by never ignoring potential threats. And I could see Dante Marchetti rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator interrupted mid-hunt, his expression shifting from annoyance to something far more calculated as his security chief, a bear of a man named Luca, who had the kind of eyes that missed absolutely nothing, appeared at his elbow and spoke urgently into his ear. The Yakuza representatives were already moving toward the exit, with their own bodyguards forming a protective cordon, and the underbosses were reaching for phones and weapons in equal measure. And through it all, Dante stood perfectly still for just a moment, his gray eyes scanning the room like he was solving an equation that the rest of them couldn't even see. I'd studied his file obsessively during my training, memorizing the details of a man who'd inherited a criminal empire at 19 when his father had been gunned down in a restaurant parking lot, who'd consolidated power through a combination of strategic brilliance and utterly ruthless violence, who'd modernized the Marchetti family's operations by embracing technology and legitimate business fronts while maintaining the iron-fisted control that had kept rival organizations at bay for over a decade. The photos in his file hadn't prepared me for the reality of him. The way he moved through space like he owned not just the room, but the very air inside it. The intelligence that burned behind those cold gray eyes like winter fire. The sense of contained danger that radiated from him, even in his most casual moments. The unexpected humanity I'd glimpsed in unguarded instances when he'd thought no one was watching and let his mask slip just enough to reveal the weight of the crown he wore. I'd made it a point to never be in the same room with him during my entire assignment, maintaining my invisibility by staying in my cubicle analyzing network traffic and sending encrypted reports to my handler about the patterns of illegal activity I uncovered. But I'd watched him on the security monitors more times than I could count, studying the way he conducted meetings with the precision of a chess master planning moves 3 steps ahead, noticing the respect and fear he commanded in equal measure from men who'd built their own reputations on violence and intimidation, observing the small kindnesses he showed to the legitimate employees who had no idea they were working for a criminal organization, remembering names, asking about families, creating an atmosphere of loyalty that made my job infinitely more complicated because it was easier to condemn monsters than it was to reconcile the contradictions of a man who paid for his secretary's daughter's cancer treatment while simultaneously ordering executions for territorial violations. The monitors showed the evacuation proceeding smoothly, people streaming toward the stairwells and emergency exits with the practiced efficiency of quarterly fire drills, and I knew I had maybe 2 minutes before someone in building security checked the sensors and realized there was no actual fire. Maybe 3 minutes before they started reviewing camera footage to find out who'd triggered the false alarm. Maybe 5 minutes before Luca and his team of ex-military security specialists tracked the action back to me and came looking for answers I couldn't possibly give without revealing exactly what I was and what I'd done and what I knew. I should have run right then, should have grabbed my bag from my desk and disappeared into the midday crowds on the street below. Should have called my handler and begged for emergency extraction before Dante's people could connect the dots. But instead I stood frozen, watching the conference room empty out, watching Dante pause at the doorway to look back at something, and then his head turned, tilted up slightly. And I realized with ice-water certainty flooding through my veins that he was looking directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room, looking at me, somehow, impossibly, as if he could feel my eyes on him through the digital interface and the floors between us. His expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and curiosity, and a dangerous kind of focus that made me feel like a rabbit that had just realized the hawk's shadow was directly overhead. And then Luca was pulling him toward the exit, and the screen went dark as they cleared the floor. And I was alone with the shrieking alarms and the certainty that I'd just changed the trajectory of my entire life in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably my handler wondering why Marchetti Industries was evacuating. But I couldn't make myself reach for it. Couldn't tear my eyes away from the exterior camera feed that showed the rooftop across the street, where the shadow with the rifle had vanished like smoke and wind, leaving behind only the evidence of what almost happened, and the terrible knowledge that someone had tried to assassinate Dante Marchetti in broad daylight during a high-profile meeting, which meant someone wanted not just him dead, but wanted it to look like a message, wanted the Yakuza to believe the Italians had betrayed them, wanted to start a war that would tear apart the carefully maintained balance of power that kept the city's underworld from exploding into open violence. The alarms cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing in the sudden silence, and I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the security alcove, multiple sets, moving fast, moving with purpose, and I knew with sinking certainty that my time had run out, that the consequences of my choice were about to arrive in the form of Luca's massive hand closing around my arm and Dante's cold gray eyes demanding explanations I couldn't give without condemning myself. The door to the alcove swung open, and Luca filled the doorway like a wall of muscle and barely contained menace, his scarred face expressionless, but his eyes holding the kind of dangerous intelligence that had kept him alive through 2 decades of mob warfare. And when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle, almost regretful, like an executioner who took no pleasure in his work, but would see it done regardless. "Mr. Marchetti wants to see you, Miss Volkoff," he said, and the way he used my full name told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly my cover was already blown, how completely I'd miscalculated the consequences of my impulsive heroism, how absolutely fucked I was in ways that made my FBI training and my carefully rehearsed contingency plans seem like children's games played at the edge of an abyss. Now, Dante's office smelled like leather and expensive whiskey, but all I could focus on was the gun resting on his desk, not threatening, not pointed in my direction, just sitting there beside a crystal tumbler and a stack of contracts, like it was as natural and necessary as a stapler or a pen, and the way his fingers drummed beside it with patient, methodical precision, each tap measured and deliberate like a countdown to something I couldn't predict but knew instinctively would change everything about the precarious position I'd put myself in when I'd decided that saving his life was worth destroying my own. Luca had escorted me through the building with a grip on my arm that was firm without being painful, professional without being cruel, guiding me past clusters of confused employees still milling in the lobby and up a private elevator that required both a keycard and a fingerprint scan, rising through floors I'd never been authorized to access during my 6 months of carefully maintained invisibility, arriving finally at the penthouse level, where the legitimate face of Marchetti Industries gave way to something that felt more honest in its barely concealed danger. The office itself was a study in contradictions that somehow perfectly encapsulated everything I'd learned about the man who occupied it. Sleek modern furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary positioned against exposed brick walls that spoke of the building's industrial history. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city Dante controlled from the shadows, and scattered throughout the space like Easter eggs waiting to be discovered. small revelations of unexpected depth that made him infinitely more complicated than the monster his FBI file had painted him to be. There was a Steinway grand piano in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light and bearing the subtle wear marks of regular use rather than decorative display. And the bookshelves that lined one wall held volumes that ranged from Marcus Aurelius to modern philosophy, first editions mixed with dog-eared paperbacks in a way that suggested they were actually read rather than acquired for show. And on the wall behind his desk hung a single photograph. Not the expected portrait of power or family legacy, but a candid shot of a young Dante, maybe 7 or 8 years old, laughing while an older man who must have been his father lifted him onto broad shoulders, both of them caught in a moment of uncomplicated joy that made my chest ache with the weight of knowing how that story ended. Dante himself sat behind the massive mahogany desk with the kind of absolute stillness that predators possess when they're deciding whether something is prey or threat. His charcoal suit jacket discarded over the back of his chair, and his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked with tattoos that I knew from his file represented his family's history and his personal kill count, ink that transformed skin into a ledger of violence and loyalty that couldn't be erased. He was 32 years old according to the intelligence I'd memorized, but his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from making impossible decisions for more than half his life, from carrying the weight of an empire built on blood and maintained through constant vigilance against enemies who would exploit any moment of weakness, from understanding that trust was a currency more valuable and more dangerous than any amount of money his organization moved through its labyrinthine network of legitimate and criminal enterprises. I'd been standing in front of his desk for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking visibly, while Dante studied me with an intensity that made me feel like he was cataloging every micro-expression and nervous gesture, building a psychological profile in real time that would reveal all the secrets I'd spent 6 months protecting with careful mediocrity and strategic invisibility. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut, and I understood with growing certainty that this was a test, that he was waiting to see if I would break and start babbling explanations or maintain enough composure to suggest I had nothing to hide. And every instinct I'd developed through FBI training screamed at me to stick to my cover story no matter how flimsy it sounded in the face of his evident skepticism. "Miss Volkoff," he said finally, and his voice was nothing like I'd expected from watching him on security monitors barking orders or negotiating deals. It was quieter, almost gentle, with an undertone of genuine curiosity that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been, because it suggested he was actually interested in understanding me rather than simply punishing me for the disruption I'd caused. "You've worked in our data analysis department for 6 months, maintained a spotless record, never missed a deadline, never complained about the admittedly tedious nature of network traffic analysis, and never once caused any sort of disruption that would bring you to the attention of management or security. So I find myself extremely curious about what would motivate you to pull a fire alarm during one of the most important meetings this company has conducted in the past 5 years, potentially destroying business relationships that took months to cultivate and costing us millions in lost opportunities and damaged credibility." His fingers stopped their rhythmic drumming and moved instead to the crystal tumbler, lifting it to his lips in a gesture so casual and unhurried that it felt deliberately staged, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed expensive scotch that probably cost more than my monthly rent, buying himself time to observe my reaction while I scrambled to assemble a response that would sound convincing to a man whose survival had depended on his ability to detect lies and manipulation in every interaction. The cover story I'd hastily constructed while Luca had marched me through the building suddenly felt pathetically thin, transparent as tissue paper held up to light. But it was all I had between me and the abyss of admitting what I really was, and what I'd really seen, and what that would mean for whatever remained of my life expectancy, once Dante Marchetti understood that an FBI informant had been embedded in his organization for half a year. "I thought I smelled smoke," I said, and even to my own ears the words sounded hollow and rehearsed. the excuse of someone who hadn't had enough time to craft something believable, and I watched Dante's expression shift into something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been edged with such evident danger. I panicked. I know it seems irrational, but my apartment building had a fire when I was a child, and I reacted without thinking, and I'm so incredibly sorry for the disruption and the cost, and I completely understand if you need to terminate my employment. But I promise it wasn't malicious, it was just a moment of panic that got out of control before I could stop myself. Dante set down his glass with deliberate care, the crystal making a soft sound against the mahogany that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office. And then he leaned back in his chair with his fingers steepled in front of him, a pose that looked almost professorial, except for the violence implied in the scars that marked his knuckles and the cold calculation that never quite left his eyes. "That's a very interesting story, Miss Volkoff," he said, and the way he pronounced my last name made my stomach drop because I could hear the wheels turning behind those gray eyes, making connections I desperately needed him not to make. But it raises several questions that I'm hoping you can help me understand, because I find myself wanting very much to believe you, despite certain inconsistencies that trouble me. He stood then, moving around the desk with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body, someone who'd never had to question his right to occupy space or command attention, and I forced myself to hold my ground, even as every survival instinct screamed at me to back away from the predator closing distance with such casual confidence. "The first inconsistency," he continued, beginning to circle me slowly like a professor lecturing a student, "is that the fire alarm you pulled was located on the 23rd floor, in a security alcove that requires badge access. Your credentials don't include, which means you had to bypass the authentication system to even reach it. A curious amount of effort for someone supposedly in the grip of panic about smelling smoke." My mouth went dry as I realized how many details I'd failed to consider in my desperate rush to stop an assassination. How many digital breadcrumbs I'd left scattered through the building's security systems, how thoroughly I'd underestimated the level of scrutiny that would be applied to my actions once Dante's formidable intelligence focused on unpacking what had happened. He moved behind me, and I felt the weight of his attention on the back of my neck like a physical touch. And I understood that this was psychological warfare conducted with surgical precision, breaking down my defenses by controlling the space and the pacing and the revelation of information in a way that gave me no opportunity to regain my equilibrium. "The second inconsistency," Dante said, his voice coming from somewhere behind my left shoulder, "is that our security cameras show you moving through the building with considerable urgency, approximately 4 minutes before you pulled the alarm, taking the emergency stairwell rather than the elevators, checking your phone repeatedly, exhibiting all the behaviors of someone with a very specific destination and purpose rather than someone reacting to the vague sensation of smelling smoke in a building with state-of-the-art air filtration systems that would have triggered automated alerts long before human senses detected anything unusual." He completed his circle and stood directly in front of me now, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that mixed with the underlying scent of danger that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a flame. And his eyes searched my face with an intensity that made me feel completely transparent, as if all my carefully constructed lies and rehearsed responses were written across my features in a language he'd learned to read fluently through years of surviving in a world where deception was currency and trust was lethal. "The third and most troubling inconsistency," he continued, and something in his tone made my heart rate spike with fresh adrenaline, "is that you've worked here for 6 months, maintaining perfect attendance and exemplary performance, never once deviating from your established patterns or drawing attention to yourself in any way, which suggests either remarkable dedication to mediocrity or a very specific kind of professional discipline that comes from training rather than natural temperament." I opened my mouth to protest, to reinforce my flimsy cover story with whatever conviction I could muster. But before I could form words, the office door opened and Luca entered without knocking. moving with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested something significant had happened, and I watched Dante's attention shift from me to his security chief with the instantaneous focus of a man who'd learned to prioritize threats through brutal experience. Luca leaned close and whispered something I couldn't hear, his scarred face grave and his eyes flicking toward me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, and I saw Dante's entire demeanor transform in the space between heartbeats, the almost playful intellectual curiosity vanishing beneath something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Show me," Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that expected instant obedience, and Luca produced a tablet from inside his jacket, swiping through screens before handing it over with the careful respect of someone delivering evidence of catastrophic importance. I watched Dante's face as he studied whatever was displayed on that screen, watched his jaw tighten and his eyes narrow, and something like shock flash across his features before being ruthlessly suppressed beneath his usual mask of controlled calculation. And when he looked up at me again, everything about his expression had changed in ways that made my blood run cold, with the certainty that whatever Luca had shown him had fundamentally altered the nature of this interrogation. "They found the nest," Dante said, and though he was speaking to Luca, his eyes never left my face, watching for my reaction with the focused intensity of someone conducting a test I didn't know I was taking. Rooftop of the building across the street, perfect sightline to the conference room, professional setup with a Barrett M82 and subsonic ammunition that would have punched through the window glass without shattering it, until after the bullet had already crossed the room and taken my head off. The shooter was gone before building security could reach the roof, but he left behind a single spent shell casing that forensics is analyzing now, along with evidence of surveillance equipment that had been monitoring our meeting for at least the past hour. The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed what he was saying, understanding with sickening clarity that my desperate gamble had worked, but had also exposed me to scrutiny that was somehow both more and less dangerous than I'd anticipated. Because Dante now knew that someone had tried to kill him, and that my inexplicable fire alarm had been the only thing standing between him and a sniper's bullet, which meant he knew I'd saved his life, but also meant he knew I'd somehow detected a threat that his own extensive security apparatus had missed. His eyes bored into mine with an intensity that felt like being dissected, and I could practically see him reassembling his understanding of who I was and what I might represent, cycling through possibilities that ranged from lucky coincidence to elaborate conspiracy, trying to determine whether I was an asset or a threat, or something more complicated that defied easy categorization. "So let me ask you again, Miss Volkov," Dante said, and his voice had dropped into a register that was barely above a whisper, but somehow more commanding than any shout could have been, vibrating with contained emotion that might have been anger, or might have been something more complex that involved gratitude and suspicion in equal measure. "Why did you pull that fire alarm? And please understand that I will know if you're lying to me, because I've spent my entire adult life learning to read people the way you read code, and right now, your response to this information is going to determine whether you walk out of this office under your own power, or whether Luca escorts you somewhere significantly less comfortable, where we can have a much longer and more detailed conversation about exactly what you know and who you're working for." The weight of the moment pressed down on me like physical force, and I understood that I was standing at a crossroads where every possible path led to some version of destruction. I could maintain my cover story and risk Dante concluding I was part of the assassination plot. I could confess to being FBI and guarantee my own death once his organization verified my credentials, or I could try to thread some impossible needle of partial truth that might buy me enough time to figure out how to survive the catastrophic situation I'd created by choosing to save a man whose existence was antithetical to everything I'd sworn to uphold when I'd taken my oath as a federal agent. Before I could formulate any response, before I could make the choice that would seal whatever remained of my fate, my phone buzzed in my pocket with the specific rhythm that indicated an encrypted message from my FBI handler, and I saw Dante's eyes drop to my jacket pocket where the vibration was clearly audible in the tense silence, and then his hand moved with casual speed to the gun on his desk, not picking it up, but resting his fingers on the grip in a gesture that managed to be both completely relaxed and utterly threatening. "I think," Dante said, his voice soft and deadly as a blade sliding between ribs, "you should answer that, Miss Volkov. And perhaps we can finally have an honest conversation about exactly what kind of game you're playing and whether you understand just how badly you've miscalculated the consequences of whatever noble impulse made you think saving my life was worth exposing yourself to the attention of someone who has built an empire on his ability to identify and eliminate threats before they can fully materialize." I woke up to find Dante Marchetti sitting in the chair beside my bed, and I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from crossing irrevocable thresholds that my life would never be the same, that whatever carefully constructed identity I'd built over 26 years had been shattered as completely as the window of my apartment that now lay in glittering fragments across my bedroom floor, catching the dim light from the street lamps outside and transforming the wreckage of my supposed sanctuary into something that looked like the aftermath of the explosion, rendered in broken glass and splintered wood. The confrontation in Dante's office had ended not with the confession he'd been pushing for, but with something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. My FBI handler's encrypted message had been a warning that my cover was blown, that someone inside the bureau had leaked my identity to unknown parties, that I should extract immediately using the emergency protocols we'd established when I'd first accepted this assignment. And I'd read that message while Dante watched me with those cold, gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing, watching my face drain of color as I understood that I was suddenly alone and exposed in ways that made my previous paranoia seem quaintly optimistic about my chances of survival. He'd taken my phone from my nerveless fingers with surprising gentleness, read the message himself, with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to something that looked almost like understanding. And then he'd made a call to Luca that had set in motion a chain of events I was still trying to process through the fog of exhaustion and shock that had finally caught up with me after the adrenaline of the day had burned itself out. Dante had sent men to my apartment to collect my things and secure the location. Standard protective procedure that I'd recognized from my training, even as my mind rebelled against accepting protection from the very man I'd been sent to help destroy. And they'd found the ransacked apartment, and the message written in what forensics would later confirm was pig's blood across my bathroom mirror. 3 words in Cyrillic script that translated to "traitors die slow," a threat that was simultaneously specific enough to confirm someone knew exactly what I was, and vague enough to suggest the torture would be creative and extended. The kind of psychological warfare that Russian organized crime had perfected over generations of brutal enforcement. Luca had made the decision to extract me from my compromised location without waiting for my consent, bundling me into an SUV with tinted windows while his team swept my apartment for explosives and surveillance devices. And somewhere during the drive to wherever we were going now, the reality of my situation had crashed over me like a wave, and I'd simply shut down, my mind retreating into a kind of protective numbness that lasted until I'd found myself being guided into a bedroom in what appeared to be a converted brownstone in a neighborhood I didn't recognize, where I'd collapsed onto the bed, still fully clothed, and fallen into unconsciousness that felt more like my body and brain staging a mutual revolt against the impossibility of everything that had happened. Now I was awake in darkness that felt thick and oppressive, my mouth dry and my body aching with the kind of tension that came from sleeping in the rigid posture of someone who didn't feel safe enough to truly relax. And Dante Marchetti was sitting approximately 6 feet away in a leather wingback chair that looked like it had been positioned specifically for this purpose. His suit jacket gone and his shirt sleeves still rolled up. One ankle crossed over the opposite knee in a pose that would have looked casual, if not for the absolute alertness in his eyes that suggested he'd been sitting there watching me sleep for an indeterminate amount of time. There was a lamp on the bedside table casting warm light that didn't quite reach the corners of the room, creating an intimate circle of visibility that somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. And I realized with a start that brought me fully awake that I was in a stranger's house under the protection of a man whose organization I'd been actively working to dismantle, wearing yesterday's clothes and smelling like fear sweat and desperation, completely at the mercy of someone who had every reason to view me as a threat, and no particular obligation to keep me alive beyond whatever strategic value I might represent. "You talk in your sleep," Dante said, and his voice in the quiet darkness was surprisingly gentle, lacking the edge of threat that had characterized our earlier conversation. And I wondered with creeping horror what secrets I might have revealed in my unconscious state, what operational details or personal vulnerabilities I'd exposed while my defenses were down, and my subconscious mind processed the trauma of the day through fragmented dreams. Nothing particularly revealing, in case you're wondering. Mostly numbers, and what sounded like lines of code, with occasional mentions of someone named Sarah, who I'm guessing is either a sister or a close friend you're worried about, given the distress in your voice when you asked her to forgive you for something you didn't specify. The mention of my younger sister made my chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with my immediate situation, and everything to do with the realization that anyone who wanted to hurt me now had access to leverage. I'd tried desperately to keep separate from my undercover work. Family connections I'd minimized, in my cover identity specifically to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. And I sat up slowly, pushing my hair back from my face with hands that trembled slightly, despite my best efforts at projecting calm. "What time is it?" I asked, my voice rough from sleep and dehydration. And Dante glanced at his watch with the kind of automatic precision that suggested he always knew exactly what time it was, maintaining the kind of temporal awareness that came from years of coordinating operations where timing meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "A little past 3 in the morning," he said, and then he gestured toward the nightstand, where I noticed for the first time a bottle of water and 2 white pills on a small plate, the kind of thoughtful preparation that felt jarringly at odds with the situation we were in and the threat he theoretically represented. "Aspirin, not poison. You're going to have a headache when the adrenaline fully wears off, and I find that conversations tend to be more productive when both parties aren't dealing with pain that could be easily prevented. So I'd recommend taking them, even though I understand that accepting anything from me probably feels like a violation of whatever protocols your FBI training drilled into you about maintaining boundaries with subjects under investigation." I reached for the water bottle with movements that felt disconnected from my body, going through the mechanical motions of unscrewing the cap and swallowing the pills because he was right about the headache that was already building behind my eyes, and the casual way he referenced my FBI affiliation made it clear that whatever illusions I'd harbored about maintaining plausible deniability had been thoroughly demolished by the events of the past 12 hours. The water was cold and clean, and I drank half the bottle in desperate gulps that did nothing to wash away the taste of fear and failure that coated my mouth like ash. And when I finally lowered the bottle and met Dante's eyes across the small space between us, I found him watching me with an expression that was impossible to read. Something complex and layered that might have included calculation and curiosity, and something else that looked almost like concern if I'd been naive enough to believe that someone in his position could afford genuine empathy for an enemy who'd infiltrated his organization. "We need to talk about your situation," Dante said, and he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, in a posture that managed to be both relaxed and intensely focused. And I understood that whatever protection I'd been afforded by unconsciousness and the late hour was about to evaporate in the face of hard questions that required answers I wasn't sure I could give without sealing my own death warrant. "Mikhail Orlov, you know that name, yes? Head of the Solntsevskaya Bratva's American operations, Russian organized crime with roots going back to the Soviet collapse, known for particularly creative approaches to violence and a complete disregard for the traditional rules that govern how families interact in contested territories. He's been trying to start a war between my organization and the Yamaguchi Gumi for the past 6 months, staging provocations designed to look like treaty violations, spreading rumors about disrespect and betrayal, pushing both sides toward a conflict that would destabilize the entire eastern seaboard and create opportunities for the Bratva to expand into territories they've historically been locked out of by our mutual agreements. He paused, watching my reaction with the kind of attention that suggested he was cataloging every micro-expression and using them to build a psychological profile in real time, and I forced myself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away from the intensity of his focus, to protect myself from the vulnerability of being so thoroughly observed by someone whose survival depended on his ability to detect weakness and exploitation opportunities. The assassination attempt this afternoon was Orlov's play, Dante continued, his voice taking on an edge of controlled anger that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. The kind of cold fury that was infinitely more dangerous than hot rage, because it suggested calculation rather than impulse. Professional sniper, military-grade equipment, perfect timing to coincide with the Yakuza delegation's visit. If that bullet had found its target, the Yamaguchi-gumi would have assumed they'd been lured into a trap, that my invitation to negotiate was actually an elaborate setup for an ambush, and they would have responded with the kind of overwhelming force that their reputation demands, killing my people, burning our operations, starting a war that would have consumed millions in resources and hundreds of lives, while Orlov positioned himself as a neutral mediator, offering to help restore peace in exchange for concessions that would have fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in ways that benefited only him. The scope of what he was describing made my head spin with implications I hadn't considered when I'd made my split-second decision to pull that fire alarm, and I realized with sinking certainty that I'd stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple assassination attempt, that the intelligence I'd been gathering for the FBI about money laundering and cryptocurrency fraud was utterly insignificant compared to the geopolitical chess game being played by organizations that operated with the resources and ruthlessness of nation-states. But here's where your situation becomes particularly interesting, Miss Volkov, Dante said, and the way he used my last name felt deliberate, emphasizing the Russian heritage that was now working against me in ways I'd never anticipated when I'd accepted this assignment. You, with your Russian surname and your FBI credentials and your convenient presence in my organization for the past 6 months, were supposed to be the perfect scapegoat. Once I was dead, and the Yakuza started demanding answers, Orlov's people would have anonymously leaked evidence of your federal affiliation, making it look like a sanctioned operation gone wrong, suggesting that the FBI was working with the Italians to eliminate competition, creating exactly the kind of institutional paranoia that would have made any kind of peaceful resolution impossible, while also discrediting American law enforcement, to the point where we'd never trust intelligence from federal sources again. My stomach dropped as I processed the full implications of what he was saying, understanding that I'd been set up not just to fail, but to die in a way that would serve multiple strategic purposes, that someone with access to FBI operational details had deliberately placed me in Dante's organization, knowing that my presence would eventually be weaponized against both him and the bureau I'd sworn to serve, and the betrayal burned through my chest like acid because I'd trusted my handler, trusted the system, trusted that my sacrifice meant something more than becoming a convenient corpse that served someone else's agenda. The message on your mirror wasn't from Orlov, Dante continued, and something in his tone suggested he was delivering information he knew would hurt, but that I needed to hear regardless of the pain it would cause. My people traced it to a contract operator who works exclusively for compromised federal agents, looking to eliminate witnesses or cover up their own criminal activities. Someone inside your FBI chain of command wanted you dead before you could report back about what you'd seen, before you could start asking questions about why you were really placed in my organization, before you could connect the dots and realize that your entire assignment was designed to fail in the most catastrophic and publicly visible way possible. The room swayed around me as I struggled to process this information, my mind racing through memories of briefings and encrypted communications, trying to identify which of the handlers and supervisors I'd trusted might have been playing a longer game that involved my death as a strategic component, and the paranoia that had been my constant companion throughout this assignment suddenly felt like completely justified survival instinct, rather than irrational anxiety. "Agent Morrison," I whispered, the name escaping my lips before I could stop myself, and I saw Dante's eyes sharpen with interest at this confirmation of something he'd clearly already suspected. He was my primary handler, the one who recruited me, who designed my cover identity, who received all my reports and coordinated my activities. But he always seemed more interested in my proximity to you than in the actual evidence I was gathering, always pushing me to find ways to get closer to your personal operations, asking questions about your schedule and your security measures that felt more tactical than investigative. Dante nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed a theory he'd been developing, and he pulled out his phone, swiping through screens before turning it toward me to display a photograph of Agent Morrison, shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize, at what appeared to be some kind of upscale restaurant, the kind of clandestine meeting that would have been unremarkable except for the timestamp that indicated it had occurred 2 weeks before my assignment began. "Viktor Kuznetsov," Dante said, identifying the man in the photo. "Orlov's second in command and the architect of most of his more sophisticated operations. We've had surveillance on him for months, tracking his movements and contacts, trying to understand the full scope of Orlov's infiltration efforts. And imagine my surprise when we identified a senior FBI agent among his regular dinner companions, meeting monthly at restaurants that sweep for electronic surveillance, engaging in the kind of operational security that suggests they're coordinating something significantly more substantial than an intelligence-sharing arrangement between law enforcement and informants. The implications crashed over me like ice water, washing away whatever remaining illusions I'd harbored about the integrity of my assignment or the nobility of my sacrifice. And I understood with terrible clarity that I'd been nothing more than a pawn in a game where all the players had been moving pieces I couldn't see, working toward objectives that had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with power and money and the kind of corruption that flourished in the shadows where organized crime and law enforcement and political influence all bled together into something that defied easy categorization as good or evil. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Wasn't sure I could handle knowing whether Dante planned to use me as a bargaining chip or eliminate me as a security risk or something else entirely that my exhausted mind couldn't anticipate. Dante leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that was impossible to read, and the silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke, his words measured and deliberate in a way that suggested he'd been considering this question long before I'd asked it. "You have a choice to make, Miss Volkov," he said, and something in his tone made it clear that this was perhaps the most important decision I would ever make, the kind of crossroads where every path led to irreversible consequences. "You can accept my protection and work with me to identify everyone involved in this conspiracy, feeding false information back to Morrison and helping me track Orlov's network while we figure out who else in the FBI has been compromised and what their ultimate objective is, becoming in effect a double agent working against the organization you swore to serve. Or you can take your chances alone, walking out of this house and trying to survive without the resources or connections or institutional support that might have kept you alive before your cover was blown and your handler decided you were more valuable dead than alive as a witness to his corruption." The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all, and we both knew it. But I appreciated that he'd framed it as one anyway, giving me the illusion of agency even as circumstance and survival instinct pushed me inexorably toward the only option that didn't end with my death in some alley or safe house, my body discovered weeks later after the smell finally prompted neighbors to call the police. Another statistic in the endless war between law enforcement and organized crime that nobody would remember or mourn beyond the perfunctory services reserved for failed operatives. "If I do this," I said slowly, thinking through implications and consequences even as I spoke, "if I become your spy inside the FBI, feeding them false intelligence and helping you hunt Orlov, what guarantee do I have that you won't just use me up and dispose of me once I'm no longer useful? that this isn't just a slower and more elaborate path to the same ending where I die because I know too much and represent too much liability to be allowed to live. Dante stood then, moving toward the window where he pulled back the curtain to reveal a view of brownstone facades and tree-lined streets that suggested we were somewhere in Brooklyn, one of the upscale neighborhoods that had been transformed by gentrification from working-class immigrant communities into expensive enclaves where organized crime maintained safe houses disguised as legitimate residences. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sincerity that I wanted desperately to believe even as my training screamed warnings about manipulation and psychological warfare. I could tell you that I'm a man of honor who keeps his word, that I value loyalty above almost everything, and reward those who prove themselves trustworthy with protection and resources that would ensure your safety indefinitely, he said, his reflection visible in the window glass. But you're too intelligent to accept those assurances at face value, too well trained to trust promises made by someone whose entire life has been built on calculated deception and strategic violence. So instead, I'll tell you something that's both more honest and more dangerous for me to admit. You saved my life this afternoon, threw away everything you'd worked for and exposed yourself to catastrophic consequences because you made a split-second decision that my life was worth preserving, despite everything you knew about who I am and what I've done. And that kind of instinctive moral courage is rare enough that I find myself wanting very much to understand what drives it and whether it represents something I can trust or simply naivete that will get you killed in a world that doesn't reward heroic gestures. He turned from the window to face me directly, and in the dim light I could see something in his expression that looked almost vulnerable. A crack in the armor he presented to the world that suggested this admission cost him more than he wanted to reveal. I'm not a good man, Miss Volkoff, Dante said quietly, and I won't pretend that working with me will somehow redeem your conscience or justify the compromises you'll have to make. But I can promise you this, as long as you're honest with me, as long as you don't betray the trust I'm offering, despite every strategic reason I have to simply eliminate you as a security risk, I will keep you alive and ensure that Orloff and Morrison and everyone else involved in this conspiracy understands that coming after you means going through me and the full resources of an organization that has survived and thrived for 3 generations by being absolutely ruthless about protecting its own. The weight of this moment pressed down on me like physical force, and I understood that my answer would determine not just whether I lived or died, but what kind of person I would become in whatever life remained after this night. Whether I would cling to the moral certainty that had brought me into this assignment, or embrace the moral ambiguity that seemed to be the only path to survival in a world where good and evil were far more complicated than the binary distinctions I'd been taught to believe in. Before I could formulate a response, before I could commit to the devil's bargain Dante was offering, my phone, which Luca had apparently returned to the nightstand while I slept, began vibrating with an incoming call, and when I picked it up with shaking hands, I saw Morrison's name on the screen, and I looked up at Dante with wide eyes that asked a question I didn't have words for, and he nodded once, a gesture that said, "Answer it." Let's see how deep this corruption goes, and I accepted the call that would seal my fate one way or another. Morrison's familiar voice in my ear saying, "Sarah, thank God you're alive. We need to meet immediately. There's been a development." And I knew with sinking certainty that the development he was referring to was probably a plan to ensure I didn't stay alive much longer. And Dante's eyes held mine across the small distance between us as I made my choice, as I stepped across the line that separated federal agent from traitor, as I said into the phone with a steadiness I didn't feel, where and when, committing myself to a path that would either lead to justice or damnation, or possibly both at once. Living in a Mafia safe house taught me that danger has many faces, but the most lethal one wore expensive cologne and looked at me like I was a puzzle he was desperate to solve, his gray eyes following my movements through the converted brownstone with an intensity that made me simultaneously hyper-aware of my own body and strangely comfortable in ways that terrified me because I understood with growing clarity that what I was experiencing wasn't just strategic alliance or survival-driven cooperation, but something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous that my training had never prepared me to navigate. The safe house itself was a masterpiece of hidden luxury. All exposed brick and modern fixtures designed to look like a young professional's upscale residence while concealing reinforced doors and surveillance systems that would put most government installations to shame. And I'd been living there for 2 weeks now. 2 weeks of maintaining my double deception, feeding Morrison carefully crafted lies about Dante's operations while helping Dante's people track Orlov's network through the city, spending my days analyzing data streams and my nights in strategy sessions that stretched into the early morning hours, existing in a state of constant vigilance that should have been exhausting, but instead felt strangely clarifying, as if I'd finally found a purpose that aligned with something deeper than institutional loyalty or abstract notions of justice. The meeting with Morrison had been everything Dante predicted it would be. My former handler had suggested a location that forensic analysis later revealed was positioned perfectly for a clean assassination disguised as a mugging gone wrong. And I'd worn the wire that Luca had taped to my skin with surprisingly gentle hands, listening through my earpiece as Dante and his people provided real-time guidance while I performed my role as the frightened asset desperate for extraction. Watching Morrison's face as he'd fed me lies about protective custody and internal investigations, while his eyes had kept tracking to the alley entrance where I now knew 2 of Orlov's contractors had been waiting to ensure I never made it out of that neighborhood alive. Dante's intervention had been surgical and terrifying, his people materializing from the shadows with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to years of training and operational experience, neutralizing the threat before Morrison could trigger whatever signal would have sent me to my death. And we'd left my former handler bleeding in that alley with a message carved into his expensive suit about what happened to traitors who sold out their own people. A brutal piece of theater designed to send a message through Orlov's network that Sarah Volkov was now under Marchetti protection, and anyone who came after her would face consequences that transcended the usual calculations of risk and reward. The proximity that our arrangement demanded had created an intimacy I hadn't anticipated. Late-night sessions where Dante would pour expensive scotch into crystal tumblers, and we'd review surveillance footage together, his shoulder occasionally brushing mine, as he leaned across to point out details I'd missed, moments where he'd catch me watching him play piano in the early morning hours when he thought I was asleep, and he'd smile with something that looked almost shy before launching into a Chopin nocturne that transformed the converted brownstone into something that felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary from the chaos consuming both our lives. I'd learned things about him that didn't match the monster his FBI file had painted, the way he remembered every one of his employees' children's names, the scholarship fund he maintained anonymously for families affected by mob violence regardless of which organization was responsible, the books of philosophy scattered throughout the house that bore evidence of deep engagement rather than superficial display, the moments of unexpected gentleness that suggested the capacity for something beyond the ruthless pragmatism that had kept him alive and in power for over a decade. We'd caught our first major break 3 days ago when one of Dante's underbosses, a man named Tommaso, who'd served the family since before Dante was born, had been identified meeting with one of Orlov's lieutenants in a parking garage in Red Hook. The surveillance footage showing money-changing hands and what appeared to be detailed schematics of Dante's primary residences and regular travel routes being exchanged in a betrayal so profound that I'd watched Dante's hands shake as he'd poured himself a drink afterward, the only visible sign of the emotional devastation he was experiencing at having his trust violated by someone he'd considered family. The discovery had hit him harder than I'd expected, and I'd found myself offering comfort in ways that had nothing to do with operational necessity, and everything to do with the growing recognition that I cared about his pain in ways that transcended strategic alliance, that somewhere in the past 2 weeks of forced proximity and shared purpose, I'd begun to see him not as a target or an asset, but as a person whose complexity and contradictions resonated with my own increasingly ambiguous relationship to the moral certainties I'd once held without question. Dante had made plans for a confrontation with Tommaso, arranging a meeting at one of the family's private social clubs where they could discuss the situation away from potential surveillance. But I'd noticed something in the pattern of communications that troubled me. Details that suggested Tommaso wasn't acting alone but was being coordinated by someone with access to higher-level strategic planning. Someone who understood Dante's psychology well enough to know that the emotional impact of Tommaso's betrayal would distract him from the larger pattern emerging in the data I'd been analyzing obsessively for the past 72 hours. I'd tried to explain my concerns to Dante over dinner the night before the planned confrontation, watching him dismiss my analysis with the kind of confidence that came from decades of reading people and situations, insisting that he knew Tommaso's patterns and capabilities well enough to handle whatever threat the old underboss represented. And I'd backed down because I understood that my position in his operation was still provisional, despite the intimacy we'd developed. That pushing too hard on operational decisions would reveal the extent to which I'd begun to prioritize his safety over the original objectives that had brought me into his world. The evening of the confrontation, I'd been stationed back at the safe house monitoring communications and ready to coordinate with Dante's security team if anything went wrong. But I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that had been building in my gut since I'd reviewed the morning's intelligence reports, details about Tommaso's movements over the past month that suggested a level of desperation and recklessness that didn't match the careful tradecraft evident in his meetings with Orlov's people, as if two different operations were running simultaneously, and only one of them was being directed by someone with professional intelligence experience. I'd made myself tea to settle my nerves, going through the mechanical motions of heating water and selecting one of the expensive blends Dante kept stocked in the kitchen. And it wasn't until I'd taken my first sip that I'd noticed the faint chemical taste underneath the bergamot, a bitterness that didn't belong there. And my training had kicked in with horrifying clarity as I'd recognized the distinctive profile of a sedative compound I'd learned to identify during my FBI chemical warfare preparedness training. The room had started tilting, even as I'd stumbled toward my phone to call Luca, my vision blurring at the edges, and my coordination failing, as whatever had been in that tea hit my system with devastating efficiency. And my last coherent thought before consciousness slipped away had been the terrible understanding that someone inside Dante's inner circle had poisoned me in his own safe house, that the threat we'd been hunting had been closer than either of us had realized, and that Dante was walking into Tommaso's confrontation without knowing that the real trap had already been sprung here, in the place he'd promised would keep me safe. And I'd tried to form his name with lips that wouldn't cooperate, tried to warn him that everything we'd planned was compromised. But the darkness had taken me under like water, closing over a drowning swimmer's head. And my last sensation had been hitting the hardwood floor and hoping desperately that I would wake up again to see those gray eyes one more time and tell him all the things I'd been too careful and too frightened to admit about what he'd come to mean to me in the brief weeks we'd had together. I woke up in Dante's arms, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be someone's everything, even if that someone ruled in an empire of blood, because the way he was holding me against his chest, with a grip that bordered on painful, suggested he'd been terrified of losing me in ways that transcended strategic calculation or operational concerns, his heart hammering against my cheek with a rhythm that spoke of fear and relief in equal measure. And when I tried to move, to pull back enough to see his face and understand what had happened in the hours I'd lost to unconsciousness, his arms only tightened around me as if he could protect me from whatever dangers still lurked in the shadows by the simple act of refusing to let go. The room around us was unfamiliar. Some kind of medical facility, judging by the antiseptic smell and the IV line running into my arm. But it was clearly private and heavily secured, based on the presence of Luca and 3 other members of Dante's security team, positioned at strategic points around the space, their weapons visible and their expressions carrying the kind of grim satisfaction that suggested whatever threat had poisoned me had been identified and neutralized with the extreme prejudice that characterized how Dante's organization dealt with attacks against their own. And I realized with a clarity that cut through the lingering fog of whatever sedative had been in my system that I was now definitively part of that category. that somewhere in the past weeks I'd crossed from protected asset to something far more personal that warranted the kind of response typically reserved for family. "You stopped breathing," Dante said against my hair, his voice rough with emotions he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, and I could feel the tremor running through his body that suggested he was still processing the terror of watching me collapse, still dealing with the psychological aftermath of thinking he'd lost someone who'd somehow become essential to his existence in ways that defied the careful emotional distance he'd maintained throughout his entire adult life. "Luca found you on the kitchen floor turning blue, and the doctors said another 3 minutes, and we wouldn't have been able to bring you back. And I've survived assassination attempts and gang wars and hostile takeovers from rival families. But I have never been as completely terrified as I was sitting in that waiting room, wondering if you were going to wake up and realizing that somewhere along the way, you'd become more important to me than this entire fucking empire I've spent my life building and protecting." The raw honesty in his confession made my chest ache with emotions I'd been trying desperately to suppress, feelings that had no place in the complicated arrangement we'd constructed, but had grown anyway, like wild flowers through concrete. Beautiful and impossible and utterly undeniable. And I pulled back just enough to look up at his face, and saw devastation etched in the lines around his eyes. The evidence of hours spent in vigil while I'd been unconscious and vulnerable, and I reached up with the hand that wasn't connected to an IV to touch his jaw, feeling the stubble there that suggested he hadn't left my side long enough even for basic grooming, needing him to understand that whatever I felt for him had transcended professional boundaries and moral certainties weeks ago. "Tell me what happened," I whispered, because I needed to understand the full scope of the threat before I could allow myself to sink into the comfort of his embrace. Needed to know whether we were safe or simply experiencing a temporary reprieve before the next attack. And I watched something shift in Dante's expression as he transitioned from the man who'd been holding me like I might disappear to the strategist who'd built an empire on his ability to see patterns and anticipate threats before they could fully materialize. He helped me sit up against the pillows, adjusting the IV line with surprising gentleness before settling into the chair beside the bed. And I noticed that he kept one hand on my arm as if he needed the physical contact to reassure himself I was real and alive. And then he began explaining with the kind of precise detail that painted a picture of just how close we'd both come to destruction. Tommaso had indeed been compromised by Orlov's network, but not in the way we'd initially understood. The old underboss had been desperate and dying from pancreatic cancer he'd hidden from everyone, his medical bills and his desire to provide for his family after his death, making him vulnerable to Orlov's promises of money in exchange for intelligence. But the real architect of the conspiracy had been someone we'd never suspected, someone with access to Dante's inner circle and detailed knowledge of our investigation into the assassination attempt, and the ability to coordinate multiple operations simultaneously while maintaining perfect cover. Agent Morrison had been working with Orlov for over 2 years, but the true mastermind behind the attempted assassination and the subsequent conspiracy to eliminate both Dante and myself had been someone even more insidious. Morrison's supervisor at the FBI, a deputy director named Catherine Zhao, who'd been using her position to protect Orlov's operations in exchange for millions in cryptocurrency that had been funneled through the same offshore accounts I'd been tracking in my original investigation. The beautiful irony being that my legitimate intelligence gathering had actually identified the conspiracy without my ever realizing what I was looking at. Mistaking evidence of high-level corruption for simple money laundering that warranted investigation, rather than understanding I'd stumbled onto a plot that threatened to destabilize the entire balance of power between law enforcement and organized crime. My poisoning had been orchestrated by someone Zhao had planted in Dante's security team months before I'd even arrived. A mole who'd been providing intelligence to Orlov and waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate both of us in a way that would look like internal treachery, triggering the war between Dante's organization and the Yakuza that Orlov needed to expand his own territorial control. But Luca's quick response and Dante's personal physician's expertise had saved my life, and the subsequent interrogation of the mole had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy in ways that gave Dante everything he needed to coordinate a response that would end the threat permanently. The confrontation with Tommaso had still happened, but not in the way anyone had planned. Dante had realized mid-conversation that the old underboss was dying, that his betrayal had been born of desperation rather than genuine treachery, and instead of the execution everyone had expected, Dante had offered mercy in the form of a quiet retirement and financial security for Tommaso's family in exchange for detailed testimony about everyone involved in Orlov's network, information that Dante had then used to coordinate with the Yakuza and several other organizations that Orlov had been manipulating, building an alliance that had moved against the Bratva boss with overwhelming force, that left his operation in ruins and sent him fleeing back to Moscow with nothing but his life, and the knowledge that he'd catastrophically underestimated the man he'd tried to destroy. Morrison and Zhao had been delivered to federal authorities with evidence so comprehensive that their arrests had triggered an internal investigation that was currently tearing through the FBI's organized crime division, exposing years of corruption and fundamentally reshaping the relationship between law enforcement and the criminal organizations they were supposed to be monitoring. And I understood with bittersweet clarity that my original mission had ultimately succeeded in ways I'd never anticipated, just not through the methods or with the outcomes I'd originally envisioned. "So what happens now?" I asked, the same question I'd posed weeks ago, but with entirely different implications, because now I wasn't asking whether I would survive, but rather what kind of life was possible in the aftermath of everything we'd been through. Whether the connection we'd forged in crisis could translate into something sustainable, or whether we'd been bound together by circumstance rather than genuine compatibility. And I watched Dante's expression shift into something I'd never seen before, something that looked almost vulnerable, as if he was about to take a risk that terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. "Now you make a choice," he said quietly, reaching up to cut my face with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "Because I can't go back to the FBI, and I won't pretend I can be redeemed or reformed into something acceptable to conventional morality. But I also can't imagine continuing this existence without you in it. Not after you've shown me what it means to have someone choose my life over their own interests, someone who sees exactly who I am and what I've done and decides I'm worth saving anyway. And I'm offering you complete honesty about what a life with me would mean. The danger and the moral compromises, and the knowledge that you'll never be able to return to the world you came from. But also offering you everything I have and everything I am. Which isn't much in terms of conventional goodness, but includes protection and resources and a partnership where you're not just my lover but my equal in building something that might not be entirely evil, even if it can never be entirely good." The weight of his offer settled over me like a cloak, heavy with implications and consequences that would ripple through whatever remained of my life. And I thought about the woman I'd been when I'd walked into this assignment 6 months ago. So certain of the clear lines between right and wrong, so confident in the righteousness of my cause, and I recognized that she was gone as completely as if she'd never existed, replaced by someone far more complicated who understood that morality was context-dependent, and that sometimes the only way to do good in the world was to work alongside people who'd done terrible things, to build alliances in the shadows where the law couldn't reach, and conventional justice was a luxury that vulnerable people couldn't afford. I'd saved Dante's life because in that moment it had been the right thing to do regardless of who he was or what he represented, and in the weeks since he'd saved mine not just physically but in ways more profound, giving me purpose and partnership and the kind of honest connection that I'd never found in the sanitized halls of federal law enforcement, where everyone performed righteousness, while privately compromising their principles for career advancement and bureaucratic convenience. "I choose you," I said, the words simple but carrying the weight of irrevocable commitment, and I watched something transform in Dante's eyes, watched the careful control he maintained over his expressions shatter into pure relief and joy, and something that looked remarkably like love. And when he kissed me, it felt like coming home to a place I'd never known I was searching for, like finding sanctuary in the last place I'd ever expected to discover it. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever dangers we'd face and whatever moral complexities we'd have to navigate, we'd face them together as partners in the truest sense, building something new from the ashes of everything we'd both lost in the process of finding each other. 6 months later, I pulled the fire alarm during a routine security meeting in our new headquarters, just to watch Dante's face transform from confusion to understanding, to that rare, genuine smile that he reserved only for moments when I surprised him with reminders of how we'd begun. And as the alarms shrieked and his people scrambled for the exits, he crossed the room to kiss me with an intensity that suggested he was remembering the same thing I was. That sometimes salvation arrives in the form of chaos. That sometimes the only way to prevent tragedy is to embrace catastrophe. And that sometimes the person you're meant to love is the one you were sent to destroy. If only you're brave enough to choose connection over conviction and trust that the heart knows truths that the mind can never fully rationalize or reconcile with the stories we tell ourselves about who we're supposed to be.